Welcome everybody to this event. I am thrilled to be hosting a talk by Peter Godfrey-Smith on AI consciousness and broader questions about consciousness and about moral status. I can say a little bit by way of introduction for the session and how it will be formatted. So this is a talk being hosted by the NYU Mind Ethics and Policy program. For anyone unfamiliar with this program, this is a research and outreach program that examines the nature and intrinsic significance of non-human minds, with special focus on invertebrates and AI systems. And so we are very interested in exploring what types of beings can be conscious and sentient and sapient, and what kinds of moral and legal and political status they can have. And that means partly that we are interested in exploring arguments for the possibility of AI consciousness, but partly we are interested in exploring arguments against this possibility too, or at least the possibility of near-term AI consciousness. And some of those arguments will be our focus in this session. I also want to note that this talk is being co-sponsored by our partners at the Center for Bioethics and the Center for Mind, Brain, and Consciousness. And thank you, as always, to them for their support of these events and for this work in general. So let me tell you a little bit about this event then. First of all, let me introduce our speaker. For most of you, this person will not need an introduction, but I can do it anyway. Peter Godfrey-Smith is Professor of History and Philosophy of Science at the University of Sydney in Australia, after previously teaching at Stanford, Harvard, and the CUNY Graduate Center. He has written 6 books, including Other Minds, which is a wonderful book, highly recommended to everybody, now published in over 20 languages, so you have a lot of options for reading it. His most recent book is Metazoa, Animal Life and the Birth of the Mind. And he will be talking with us today about what his views about the origins of consciousness and the nature of consciousness might tell us about the prospects for AI consciousness. And so before I pass the mic over to Peter, let me just note that the way that this event will be structured is we will go for approximately the next hour and 10 minutes, and approximately half of that time will be spent with Peter giving us a talk, and the other half of that time will be spent with us all having a discussion. And the way that that discussion will work is throughout the session, you can all enter questions and comments and objections using the Q&A function on Zoom. And you can also reply to comments or upvote comments. And then when the time comes to have a discussion, I will present a set of your questions and comments and objections to Peter to get his reaction. So please do feel free to, as early as you like, start entering your thoughts in the Q&A tab, and then we can discuss them later on. And one other minor note, Peter is joining us from Australia, and they have some bad weather lurking in the background, and so hopefully the call will be nice and smooth, but if there are any choppy moments, we can, just pause and wait for the feed to come back. Okay, great. So with all of that out of the way, Peter, thank you so much for taking the time and joining us, and really looking forward to your talk.
Thanks, Jeff. It's a pleasure. Right, as Jeff said, we have some weather here, and the internet may collapse. I hope it doesn't. I've done what I can to make that less likely. And I'll see if I can get through the talk in under 40 minutes. I'm going to go quickly. I'll stop at a certain point if it seems like I'm going to go over that time. Okay, I'm going to share screen. And Sophia was going to make my head fill roughly the top right quadrant rather than just being tiny. I hope that is workable. Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm going to present a picture on some current topics: brains, computers, sentience, animals far from us, the role of biology in consciousness, and so on. And that picture will be a bit different from familiar ones. I won't be able to argue for all of it. That would take a very long time, but I will give some arguments. I'll try to show that some arguments that have been given to support other views are not good arguments. So I can at least, I think, motivate a rethinking. And with that rethinking motivated, I'll then present a positive picture, which will be mostly philosophy of mind, but I will discuss the ethical side mostly briefly at the end. Okay, here is a familiar view. Physical systems can have mental properties, including felt experience or consciousness, in virtue of their functional organization. On this view, the mental is substrate neutral or substrate independent. That's the idea that the hardware does not matter, except in practical terms. What matters is the system's organization. And you could realize the organization of a human mind in a computer system, which doesn't have proteins, DNA, and things like that, without it being a big problem of principle. Any substrate is okay if it can be suitably organized, and computers can end up through programming being organized in all sorts of ways. Okay, why believe this? Well, there are abstract arguments for some forms of functionalism that are supposed to tell us this. They would imply a kind of substrate neutrality. There's also the great intuitive force of neural replacement arguments, first given maybe by Polition or Hoagland, discussed in much detail by Chalmers. We imagine a cell-by-cell replacement of your brain with artificial control devices that have different makeup but play the same roles. As the replacement is done, your behavior, the argument supposes, doesn't change at all. You chatter away as usual, you introspect, or you seem to. Does your experience fade as the replacement of biological with non-biological parts is done? That seems a weird thing to be committed to, at least. The organization is still in place, and perhaps that's all that matters. From there, we can then look at far from us cases, invertebrate animals and computer systems, robots and the like. Now, these are all uncertain cases in practical terms because we don't know which features of our brains now are the functionally important ones. We don't know exactly what would have to be carried over or found in those other systems to be sufficient for consciousness or sentience. If we did a complete or perfect simulation of a human brain in every detail within a computer system, then allegedly we'd be fine, we'd know. But in practical contexts where less of us is in place, it's hard to know what's essential. So on this view, the problem of animals far from us and the problem of AI systems are fairly similar problems. It's a question of finding the functional properties that matter to consciousness. The physical hardware differences won't be a big thing. It's all the question of organization. Okay, I'm still so far describing the familiar picture. And all these issues matter to ethical discussions. Many people accept a form of sentientism. I have a version of that on the slide. Being sentient is necessary and sufficient for moral considerability. Now, in this talk, I'm going to use the word conscious and the word sentient interchangeably, even though there are things we could talk about here. But on this standard view, as we learn which functional properties matter for sentience, we learn which living things and also which non-living things are or will be, once they're built, sentient. And maybe some AI systems around now are not too far away from at least a basic kind of sentience. Maybe the level of uncertainty is around the same place as it is, for example, with earthworms or flies. Okay, all of that was a familiar picture. I oppose a fair bit of this. I oppose quite a lot of this. I think probably nervous systems are special. Biological properties matter to consciousness, to the possibility of consciousness. There's hence more of a divide between the cases of animals far from us and computers, but the biological properties that I think are important are found in a lot of animals, and I'll talk about flies in particular later. So for an artificial system to be a fly-like candidate for consciousness, it would need a different hardware from contemporary computer systems. It might not have to be alive, might not have to be made of exactly the same stuff as us and flies, but it would have to be closer. And the ethical side is then affected. On this view, there's more reason to be cautious with respect to treatment in the case of far from us animals than there is in the case of present-day computer systems, no matter how they're programmed. Okay, how can I make a case for the alternative view? I'll start by opposing the familiar motivations and arguments given for substrate neutrality, and then make a more cautious positive case for the importance of some biological properties of nervous systems. Okay, opposing the familiar picture. I think that philosophers, not only philosophers, but certainly philosophers, have gotten used to talking about functional properties and hardware in a way that does not entirely make sense. Now, this is an in-principle point, and later I will link it to empirical work. I also want to credit Rosa Cow, an NYU grad, all through here. I was teaching a standard philosophy of mind course at Harvard around 2006, which included what Susanna Siegel calls the long march, the march from dualism through behaviorism to the identity theory and functionalism. And Rosa was sitting in as a postdoc. And at a certain point, she began pushing back on a lot of things around the alleged irrelevance of biological details and hardware. And eventually I began to agree with her. Her main paper is now out, and we also have a not quite completed joint paper. Today's talk will be more my version, but her influence was important to me. Okay, so in principle ideas first. Philosophers have gotten used to talking about functional properties and functional profiles in a way where there's supposed to be such a thing as a perfect functional duplicate, a physical system with all the functional properties of a brain, one that does the same thing, a perfect simulation or realization in different hardware. And I don't think this really makes sense. The functional similarity of any two systems is a matter of degree. What a system or a part of a system does can be understood in both coarse and finer-grained ways. Now, the simplest way to make this point is with some details of timing. Some facts about timing in a brain are certainly functionally important, both the time which things take to happen as a whole, also the simultaneity of processes, and so on. Some other details of timing look like they probably don't matter much, but they're still there. The brain processes are still different if they're changed. Time gets ignored in classical functionalist discussions. You've got the machine table or the imagined network, and if it gets things done, then it gets things done. But neurally, timing is a big deal. So how much fidelity of timing does there have to be in a perfect duplicate? Well, that's an ill-posed question. Suppose something takes a millisecond longer, or a tenth of that, or the synchrony of two processes is not quite the same. What there is in all these cases is functional similarity to various degrees. Timing can make the point, and so can other details. There might be a few more ions here or there. Dave Chalmers, in his book, Reality Plus, talks about perfect duplicates and expresses it like this. He says, if there's a physical process in the brain that makes a difference in how the brain functions, then it will be simulated in a perfect duplicate. But this raises the same question. Is another millisecond here or there a difference? Yes, it's a difference, but a tiny one. It's a difference to experience too. If some process that's the basis of experience goes on for another millisecond in this other system, then that is a difference. I think philosophers got used to this, I think, erroneous way of talking about functional properties, in part because of habits coming from the idea of machine tables in early functionalism. Also, the fact that with computer systems of the kind that we live with, lots of timing details don't matter to a lot of what we say. Microsoft Word runs a bit faster on this machine than this one, but it does run on both. Okay, timing is just the start, as I said. All sorts of details can differ, and often the details don't matter much, but those details are still there. So first, a rethinking of functional similarity. Next, I think this undermines neural replacement arguments. Suppose your cells are slowly replaced by physically different units that, quote, do the same thing, as we're told. But they won't do exactly the same thing. As the replacements are done, tiny differences will accumulate, a millisecond here, a millimeter there. So the neural replacement arguments, when people say, you would not notice, no one would notice if your neurons were slowly replaced, those arguments depend on the idea that the person's behavior stays exactly the same. That's what we're supposed to think. That's where the pressure comes from. But whatever it means to say that you would not notice from the inside, there are going to be differences visible from the outside. Now, some people would deny this. They would say it's possible to have no differences when the physical substrate is changed. Do they really mean no differences, no millisecond scale differences? It's surely more likely that as you replace neurons, the system changes microfunctionally, and it will also change microbehaviorally in timing, fidelity of repetition, all sorts of details. This means there's no reason to believe that experience is unaffected in a slow replacement. First a little, then a lot. And this could include all kinds of transformations and fading. Now, in a moment, I'm going to compare my view to Ned Block's view, to some things he said about the biological side of consciousness. Block also rejects replacement arguments of this kind. These are some passages from the Blockheads collection on his work. Block sees neural replacement arguments as question begging. He says he thinks that even if a replacement shows no observable changes in behavior at all, sorry, that slide's actually gone up a little bit early, but it's helpful as illustration. Block says, even if a replacement shows no observable changes in behavior at all, it's question begging to say that this shows that felt experience can't change in the person whose brain is being changed. Maybe it does change, he says. That's the whole issue. And I more or less endorse what Block says, but I also accept that under the mistaken terms of the original argument, the replacement idea did put a lot of pressure on a biological view. We might decide it's resistible pressure, but it's a lot of pressure. The system, we're supposing, works the same despite physical changes. So I think the point about the nature of functional profiles and functional properties and their grain dependence is more basic as an objection. Okay, here are a few slides from the Ned Block Michael Tai exchange in the Blockheads book. Tai here is quoting Chalmers and echoing it, and this shows the kind of talk that I'm opposing, the idea that there can be no difference, that a chip can have the right input-output function. Tai quotes Chalmers and then agrees with that. And what Block does in response, he says he doesn't really accept the scenario, is tempted to deny it at least, but he allows it in order to make his point about question begging. And as I said, I think one shouldn't make the concessions that Block even provisionally makes. I think the other point is more basic. Okay. So we are freed up from thinking that substrate neutrality is compulsory in a sense, that we have to live with it. We're freed up because the usual arguments for it are not good. But that doesn't mean that there's not a lot of truth to it. It doesn't mean that you couldn't get everything that matters a lot in a physically different system, such as a computer of present-day design. So we don't yet have an argument that biological details are actually important. All that's happened is we've been freed up to ask those questions again. Might those details matter? And here, all I can do, especially in the time available, is present a picture. My view, as much as I have one, of the biological and physical basis for subjective experience. Okay, my view has two parts with uncertain relations between them. The problem of consciousness is sometimes expressed, for example, by Nagel, using the idea of point of view, subjectivity. I embrace that. And I say, yes, animal evolution, it builds things of that kind. It builds systems with points of view by taking certain kinds of sensing and action and putting them together, certain kinds of relations between them. That takes us some way to solving the problem. The other part of my view is more relevant here, and that's a view about nervous systems, the controllers. Now, this in my other work is linked to an evolutionary picture, the history of nervous systems. All that's in my Nicot lectures. I won't cover that here. What I want to cover is just the most important, the most relevant couple of points. I think nervous systems combine two features. They have point-to-point networkish causal relations of the familiar kinds. And they also have what I call large-scale dynamic properties, such as the oscillations picked up in an EEG, brainwaves, where these are somewhat distinct from the firing of neurons. They're based on slighter and slower ion movement across membranes. Now, there's a tradition that's been going for about 30 years now, at least back to Francis Crick and Christoph Koch, of suggesting that large-scale dynamic features of nervous systems play a role in experience-relevant or subjectivity-relevant aspects of cognition. Some fast, synchronized brain oscillations appear to play an integrative role, which has been studied especially in the case of vision. Now, that's just an example, and for me, it motivates a broader look at this category of neural phenomena, especially oscillatory behaviors, and the idea that nervous system activity combines the point-to-point network properties with more diffuse, somewhat holistic electrical phenomena. Okay, why do I think they matter, this class of features? Well, they seem to matter to a wide range of experience-relevant phenomena, and not just in us. This is what I want to emphasize, in animals far from us. This was a big surprise to me. I've been influenced quite a bit by the work of Bruno van Swinderen's lab in particular. His lab works on flies, and I'll talk a little bit about some of his fly papers. These two papers in particular, and I'll just say a bit about one experiment from each of these papers because there are lots. There were 2 rounds of work, essentially. The basic thing he studies is the link between large-scale brain oscillations and attention, selective attention, or something like attention in flies. And the earlier round of work showed an association between oscillations in a 20 to 30 hertz range, called the beta range, and what looks like attention to a particular object in, as it happens, fruit flies. So in one experiment in the first paper, what they did was they move a shape through the fly's visual field and note a beta range response in its brainwaves that seems to be associated with attention to the object as reflected in several things. Now, firstly, it's important that this fast beta oscillation is combined in the fly with a much slower oscillation. And that one looks more like simple perceptual tracking. The 20 to 30 hertz response is different in that it is modulated by reward, unlike the slow oscillation. It can be amped up if the fly comes to associate the stimulus with reward. It's sensitive to the shape of the object, but not to illumination, unlike the slow wave, which has the opposite properties. And in a sleep-like state, which flies have, the 20 to 30 hertz oscillation is much reduced while the slow wave is not. It's also associated with behavioral responses. The 20 to 30 hertz oscillation increases when the fly is engaged in behavioral tracking of the object. That's the first paper. The second paper takes all this much further. It's quite complicated, but I want to give you a sense of what they were able to show. They use different stimuli in the fly's visual field that flicker, and they flicker at different rates. The stimuli also have other differences, which flies are known to care about, such as size. And you can see those flicker rate differences in the brain of the fly when the fly is attending to an object with that rate. Now, those flickers are not the fast oscillations being studied. They're slower than that. They're just chosen because they leave a kind of mark in the brain, but they can be correlated. They can be phase synchronized with the faster, potentially more important oscillations. So here's one experiment. You've got two objects, a large one and a small one in the visual field. Usually flies prefer large objects, and that shows up in how their brains are tuned to flicker rates. But you can use a certain optogenetic brain stimulation method to activate a reward circuit in the fly and associate reward with the smaller of the two shapes. And then when both objects are in the fly's visual field, it's more likely to attend to the smaller one. The reward circuit makes the smaller one more interesting to it. And the endogenous 20 to 30 hertz oscillations can be correlated, phase locked to one of the object's tag frequencies or the other. If you make the smaller object more interesting with the reward circuit, the flicker rate associated with that object becomes synchronized with beta oscillations in the fly. And they take that to be suggestive that the oscillations are a mechanism for attention in a fly. Now, that's just one example. They also have work on active sleep, on anesthesia, and their relations to oscillations as well. All of this suggests there's an experience-relevant role for large-scale dynamics in the brains of flies. Now, I'm just picking one lab, a couple of papers, one kind of data. That's not all there is, obviously. But if you were to read a message off this, you'd think something like this. You'd think architecturally, there are lots of options. Animals can have a cortex or no cortex. Things like that don't matter too much to the existence of quite a lot of experience-relevant properties, attention, wake and sleep cycles, and so on. There's a lot of freedom of movement on the architectural side. A fly's brain looks nothing like ours. But when you look at nervous systems, some things that you're seeing that seem to have a connection with experience-relevant features of the animals, some of the things you're seeing there are very biological. They're not computer-like. They involve this combination of properties of neural activity I mentioned, including the more diverse, holistic, non-networky electrical properties. So what that suggests is that nervous systems allow these things. Nervous systems are special in that way. The organization of a nervous system, there's a lot more flexibility there. Animals with different bodies and different lives do all that differently. They've been shaped by evolution in different ways. But in animals separated from us by enormous evolutionary gulfs like us and flies, there are conserved features of nervous systems that are doing experience-relevant things. Okay, that's all the empirical stuff I'll talk about. Next, I want to make a more phenomenological point. I want to make a mapping between the view of nervous system activity I'm employing and a feature of experience itself. I think that what's basic to ordinary human experience, just everyday experience, is what I call experiential profiles. I resist what Searle has sometimes referred to as the building block view of conscious experience, where you have this item and that item in consciousness separate. An experiential profile, as I see it, is a total way things feel to someone at a moment. And I think these profiles are inherently multifaceted. They have a gestalt-like feature. There's something or some things in attention, others in the background. There's bodily awareness, with the whole thing modulated by mood and energy level and so on. All of that is part of what it's like to be you in a particular moment. From here, I think back to that picture of nervous system activity that I was describing a moment ago. As has been noticed by a number of people, Pisano way back, Ginsberg and Jablonka, some neuroscientists like Harris Kaplan and others, when neural activity has the form of large-scale patterns with modulation of those patterns, a range of different inputs, different sensory inputs and others have the capacity to simultaneously affect any state. You get a kind of integration for free in a sense. An internal state strongly affected by what the animal is seeing will also be modulated by tactile sensing, proprioception, and other things. So the Gestalt-like character of experiential profiles with the ebb and flow of salient modalities and attention and so on, and that role for mood and energy level, all of that is naturally explained by the view of nervous system activity that I'm describing. So the idea here is that a view of nervous system activity and a particular combination of nervous system properties has something of a bridging role with respect to the explanation of consciousness. Okay, that's my package of ideas, which I'm going to christen the NDS view, where NDS stands for Neural Dynamics of Subjectivity. It's one of a range of biological approaches to consciousness. And I'll take a moment to compare what I've said here to Ned Block's in particular. So Ned Block has defended a biological approach recently, mostly just in sketches. The biological properties that he thinks might matter are especially a certain kind of transition between electrical and chemical interactions in the brain, a back and forth of coding between electrical and chemical. He thinks of this as an important feature of nervous systems, maybe something important to consciousness. A few points, a few thoughts about Block's candidate. Firstly, I think this property might be understood as a near inevitable way of doing things once you get beyond a very simple nervous system. It can be contrasted with a purely chemical brain, which is making its way from a hypothetical construct in the hands of Gaspar Yekeli to something that has some real-world realization in very neurally simpler animals. And there are also purely electrical nervous systems as well, with no chemical synapses. And the speculation I would offer is that a purely chemical brain is always going to be small. It's not scalable. A purely electrical system is very hard to make plastic. So I think once you have a nervous system of any size with some plasticity, the to and fro that Block picks up on will be an almost inevitable feature. Now, that's not an objection to what he says. It's not a problem for him. Presumably, his combination has some evolutionary story behind it. It does show a certain kind of non-contingency, I think. More importantly, what I don't yet get from Ned's brief discussions in this area is some sense of why this is a gap-bridging sort of property, rather than just something that makes biological and engineering sense in nervous systems. In the case of my own view, I tried to point towards something like a bridging role that this story has, the link between the idea of perturbable states of activity, which depend on large-scale dynamics in nervous systems, and the Gestalt-like character of experiential profiles. So I have that question about Ned's view. Now, Ned, we've had a little bit of email exchange about this, has a possible objection to my proposal. He thinks if these large-scale dynamic properties of nervous systems were important to consciousness, in a sense, it should be more obvious. Our brains are being continually exposed to things that affect, to some extent, our large-scale dynamics in the flickering of electric lights and so on. If there is an effect here, it seems to be a rather subtle one when we think about those environmental influences. And I accept that that is a real argument. There are also other biological views. I'll just list a couple for completeness. Seth's book, Being You, I think of as in roughly this category. Searle's old paper, Consciousness, is as well. There are the adventurous views based on electromagnetic fields. A cluster of people, Pocket, Libet, and McFadden, have argued for views like that. And there's a now famous quote, I think somewhat prescient, from Dennett predicting the importance of neural details to consciousness. Okay, suppose what I've said is true, either the particular view that I sketched or just that there's something close to it, something in this family that's true. What happens when we go looking for the basis of consciousness? Well, the first thing to conclude is that artificial systems need to have something physically like those features of nervous system activity. Not arguing that nothing artificial could be conscious, but suggesting that have to be set up in a certain way. And to some extent, I would like to offer an invitation to people who think about hardware in this area to try some different ideas. Maybe it would be possible to build something with analogs of the features that I think of as important in biological nervous systems. You'd want a global, probably electric pattern like a brain's large-scale dynamic processes with perturbation of various kinds and the network-like properties underneath enabling computation. You would also want the more traditional properties involving subjectivity, point of view, and so on, ones that have another kind of gap bridging role. And maybe this could be built, but ordinary computers doing smart things today, like the large language models, I take it, are nothing like this. In that case, they're different with respect to both sets of features. They haven't got the biological nervous system properties, and they haven't got the subjectivity associated properties either. Robots with decent senses are more serious candidates. And in that case, what has to be thought about, what has to be developed is the nature of the controller. Well, what about animals far from us? Insects, jellyfish, earthworms, and the like. The issues they raise are not like the computer ones. They not only have nervous systems as controllers, but in many, perhaps all cases, they have the combination that I'm saying matters in some form, but typically in a much smaller and simpler form in most invertebrates than in animals like us, and to some extent, even in a fly. You know, part of how we got to this place, part of how we got to the neural properties I'm emphasizing is through fly work. And the flies have experience relevant large-scale dynamic properties in a much smaller brain than ours, on the 200,000 neuron scale, smaller than a bee, much smaller than an octopus. Jellyfish-like animals do have large-scale dynamics in their nervous systems of something like the relevant kind, even in Hydra, which only has a few thousand neurons. I don't know about nematodes, but here the question involves empirical uncertainties, functional differences of various kinds, and crucially, the role of simplicity and complexity. They have the right kind of properties, but they have much simpler versions of them. In response to this set of questions, I think we are very likely to end up with a gradualist view, where there's no sharp line between the yes cases, the conscious cases, and the no cases, the non-conscious ones. A gradualist view is very much suggested by our evolutionary picture. Gradual origins for consciousness are very likely. And that suggests, though it doesn't imply, a graded presence looking across different neurally simpler animals now. Suppose that's true. Suppose that in response to the questions about animals, we move to a strongly gradualist view where there's a big gray area where the answer to is this creature conscious is not clearly yes and not clearly no. Well, gradualism complicates things on both sides, not just with animals, but with artificial systems as well. Just keep an eye on the time. There's a simple way of expressing my conclusions to this talk by saying nervous systems are special, plants are out, bacteria out, And the way that nervous systems are special brings a lot of animals in, including simpler animals and ones very far from us. AI systems need new hardware. There's a way of expressing the conclusions that way. But the fact that a sharp in versus out divide is unlikely modulates and makes complicated all of this. And that shows up especially on the ethical side. If we assume sentientism and also assume a sharp divide between the yes and no cases, we can read some initial conclusions off the discussion of cases in my talk about plants, at least some invertebrates, AI systems, and so on. But with neurally simpler animals, including perhaps many insects, we have to be ready for a gray area between conscious and non-conscious, or sentient and non-sentient. And if sentience itself is graded, what becomes of sentientism? What becomes of the link between sentience and moral considerability? It would be okay, or at least easy, if there was a sharp line taking a system to a minimal yes, and then various gradations from there. Then we'd say, yes, you are morally considerable, and the way in which you are is affected by some kind of richness or complexity gradient. But the view I'm entertaining, the view that I think is likely, is one with no sharp line to a minimal yes. And that leaves us with the question, if sentience has a graded presence in this sense, then what happens to moral consideration? Okay, I do have more to say on that last question, but I'm watching the time and I think I'll stop there and leave things with that question.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Peter. That was a fantastic talk. And we already have a lot of questions and comments in the Q&A tab. A reminder to everybody that you can enter questions, comments, objections, any kind of contribution at all by clicking on the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. You can also reply to other ones and upvote them, and then we can have a discussion based on what you say. And like I said, we already have a lot of great contributions. So I have my own questions, but I'm going to start by going through some of this list so we can get to as many other people as possible. And then I might see if I can squeeze in some of my own questions along the way. So I am going to start because you engaged with his work so much during the talk with a short question from Ned Block. Ned writes, Peter, if one grants, as you don't want to do and I don't want to do either, that the replacement scenario is possible, then do you think the argument is convincing?
I'm not sure what I think, because when I think about it now, I find it sort of impossible to grant the assumptions of the argument. I mean, I can be autobiographical and say for years, when I did grant the assumptions, I thought, well, yeah, this is a very good argument. And when I went through the long march, as Susanna Siegel puts it in my courses, I would present the argument as a good argument for multiple realizability and that kind of functionalism. Now it just seems to me to be a mistake to talk of perfect duplicates in physical systems at all. Once one thinks that similarities really are a matter of degree, if I think myself back into the assumptions associated with the argument, I then immediately exit them again and say, well, no, I shouldn't be thinking about the problem that way. I mean, in the talk just now, I said that if I was to grant the assumptions, I think there's some real pressure there. I'm not quite sure what I think about Ned's claim of essentially simple question begging, but it's hard for me to, I think, give a more constructive, within the spirit of things answer, because I just think it was a mistake to grant the perfect duplicate thing at all.
Great, thank you very much. And Ned, I want to note that if you would like to also add any replies to Peter's discussion of your work, please feel free, and then I can make sure to bring that into the conversation too. I will now go to a little bit of a longer comment from Dave Chalmers, who starts with a comment that says, on timing, I take it we can simulate at least approximate timing down to the millisecond level, say. But then the worry is that precision matters. A difference of half a millisecond can still make a difference. And then he includes a passage from The Conscious Mind, which I will quickly read and then ask you to respond to. There is good reason to believe that absolute precision cannot be essential to our cognitive competence. The presence of background noise in biological systems implies that no process can depend on requiring more than a certain amount of precision. Beyond a certain point, uncontrollable fluctuations in background noise will wash out any further precision. That means that if we approximate the state of the system to this level of precision, then we will be doing as well as the system itself can reliably do. It is true that due to nonlinear effects, this approximation may lead to behavior different from the behavior produced by the system on a given occasion, but it will lead to behavior that the system might have produced had biological noise been a little different. We can then approximate the noise process itself if we want to. The result will be that the simulating system will have the same behavioral capacities as the original system, even if it produces different specific behavior on different specific occasions. The moral is that when it comes to duplicating our cognitive capacities, a close approximation is as good as the real thing. So I would love to hear your response to that passage and general point.
Okay, some of that went quickly enough, and some of it would require me to sort of think about it, I think, for a few minutes anyway. But let me say a couple of things. The idea that we could, suppose it's true that we could duplicate a system as well as this, within the tolerances that the system itself can sort of work with, as well as a system could do itself. I take it in the next bit of the passage that you read, it was conceded that this will mean that we get differences in what actually occurs. We've got the two systems, the original and the duplicate, and the duplicate will do things that are slightly different on particular occasions than the original. For me, that's a big deal. I mean, once you have the fact that the duplicate is not behaviorally indistinguishable in the sequence of things it does, once it's sort of off on a different road, even with respect to very small scale differences, for many purposes, it will be a remarkable thing, this duplicate, but it doesn't put the pressure. If we're talking about a neural replacement scenario or something of that kind, the pressure is gone, I think. It's no longer the case that we have to contemplate the possibility of no change at all in what the system does across original and duplicate. That's no longer what we're thinking about. We're thinking about something which is very similar. And as the biological controllers are replaced by artificial controllers, I think the differences ramify, they magnify, the two become more and more different. To say the same thing I said a moment ago, again, the pressure is gone with respect to the thought that we're not allowed to suppose that replacing one system with different hardware leads to a difference in experience. I think it's perfectly reasonable to think that replacing the parts with parts that behave similarly to some extent have the consequence that you get different experience. Okay, I realize that's not a reply to everything in the passage or the question, and I don't mind if Dave wants to follow up and focus again.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And Dave, please do feel free to follow up if you want to, just to make sure, because that is a little bit of a complicated exchange, and I might be misunderstanding it as well, but my sense is that the original question was gesturing at the reality that there are these micro differences even within biological carbon-based systems themselves, right? So even if we forget about silicon-based systems for a second, the carbon-based systems themselves admit of these differences, and yet we agree that they still have consciousness, they still realize consciousness. And so that shows that minute differences are not enough to make the difference here to determine whether a system is conscious or not. But once we allow that, then we should expect only a certain amount of precision from the silicon-based systems in order for there to be consciousness. And then I take it your response is that, well, the differences are just going to magnify once this new general substrate difference is introduced. It will be beyond these differences that we perceive in the biological systems. Is that correct?
Let me do it in two parts, and I'm still not sure I'm addressing exactly the question as intended, but let me do it in two parts. Each physical system has its own details of timing, its electrical details. Each system will have its own properties. Nothing will be a perfect duplicate of what's going on in here using different hardware. In virtue of my properties, I will have my experiences. The other system, in virtue of its properties, will have whatever it gets to have. If it's got a biology like mine, but some tiny differences, then it will have experiences very similar to mine. If it's had half its brain taken out and artificial parts put in that lead to a loss of these large-scale dynamic properties or a total modification of them, then it will be different inside. It will look somewhat different, and it will feel different if it feels like anything to be it. So, each system has its full set of details, and in virtue of those physical specificities, it has the mental properties that it has. So far I'm saying something I think is not very contentious. The idea of it's supposed to cause trouble for a biological view of consciousness, I take to be the idea that you can preserve everything in me while substituting my biological parts for non-biological, with non-biological parts. And I don't believe that. And I think that once we accept that each physical system will have all the details it has, which can be very fine-grained, then we have accepted that. We have accepted that there won't be a perfect duplicate of me. There will just be a system that has some properties in common and some properties not in common with me when we substitute the biological parts with artificial parts. Realize I may not be grappling with everything that Dave has in mind here, but
no, that's great. That's very helpful. Yeah, no, thank you for that. And again, there can always be follow-ups. Though we do have a lot of other questions too. So why don't we go to a few others, and then we can always revisit if time permits. So I will now go to a question from Jesse Prinz. He says, "Hi Peter, thanks for the talk. As you may know, my own views have flip-flopped about artificial consciousness. I published a paper saying that the comments flip around as people add them. I published a paper saying that we cannot know what level of organization matters for consciousness and cannot map machine levels onto our own. This led me to a Mysterian view about artificial consciousness. We cannot know. But now I incline towards thinking implementation levels are necessary. Any thoughts on how to adjudicate? How far down do we need to go if we keep the functional levels fixed? Or is the hypothesis rather that biology is needed to preserve the functional level as it is in us? And how do we decide what to include in the functional level? For example, does real time matter? One view might be that the functional level includes psychometric detail, and that in turn requires something like our biology. Is that the view you are recommending?"
I think the view I'm recommending is probably one in which, and I hadn't thought about this in quite this way before now, it's probably one in which some standard ways of talking about going up and down in levels become problematic. Suppose we take the fly work that I talked about as an illustration here of, progress. The lab made progress in working out provisionally some facts about the neural basis of some subjectivity relevant properties, the property of selective attention. How did they do that? Well, it depends on physical details. Those oscillatory processes have a particular kind of physical makeup involving ion flows across membranes, free synaptic potentials. They're physically specific in those ways, and we've learned that those things matter. Those properties exist within a fly which has properties that can be described in coarser grained terms. You know, it's got eyes, it can behave. There's a certain amount of a schematic character or slippage with respect to, you know, what was important with respect to those things. But part of what was important was very neurally and physically detailed. I guess, I mean, I'm not sure about this. I'm not sure about how to best grapple with the question, but I find myself thinking that the fly example suggests that the kinds of explanations that might lead us to progress will sort of be mixed level in a certain sense. They won't be just low level, they won't be just high level. They'll involve the way in which some very physically specific activities that nervous systems engage in combine with some more schematic features that the animals have, in virtue of which they have a point of view, they're subjects, they can see, they can act, and so on. So maybe the answer is I would gesture towards a view in which a somewhat regimented, familiar picture of we've got this level, then this level, and so on at different degrees of grain. Maybe that's not how things will go.
Great, thank you. So we can now go to a question from Alexandra Lang. So Alexandra asks, what, if anything, does it imply to you that we can produce qualitative changes in consciousness by interfering electrically or chemically, right? So neurofeedback or ECT on the electrical side, or drugs or SSRIs on the neurological side. Does the capacity to alter consciousness in these two ways imply to you in any way that electrical and chemical processes are necessary or fundamental to consciousness as we know it? Or do you think that consciousness in any substrate would allow for qualitative changes by messing with that substrate? So our ability to affect consciousness with electrical and chemical interference is not necessarily evidence for a necessity of these processes for consciousness itself.
I wouldn't claim it as evidence. I mean, someone who believes in substrate neutrality needn't have a problem with those phenomena. They'll say, you know, we have the particular mechanisms that we have. They could have been different. They could be substituted, but we have what we have. And what we have can be affected by a particular range of inputs, some chemical, some electrical. There's a relation here to Ned's interest in the back and forth between electrical and chemical in nervous systems, perhaps. There's a connection there. But I don't think of those sorts of things as evidence that pushes one way or the other.
Okay, great. Thank you. There are several questions that are asking for clarification about how to classify your view, how to map it onto traditional theories of consciousness. And so I'm going to kind of present them as a group. So Andreas Mogensen asks a version of this question. So does Anil Seth. So what Andreas Mogensen says is your view roughly a form of fine-grained functionalism? In other words, consciousness requires a certain functional organization of matter, but at a minute level of detail that far exceeds, say, the input, state, output, causal relations that might figure in folk psychological knowledge. And then the version of that question asked lower down by Anil Seth is, are you arguing that implementation details and substrate matters for consciousness first, in virtue of enabling a particular kind of functional or dynamical organization, or second, for some more fundamental reason, such as the idea that the true physical substrate of consciousness is not functional or dynamic properties, but rather EM fields or metabolism or something else along those lines. So is this best characterized as a fine-grained functional view or as some other, maybe more physicalist kind of view?
In response to the sort of first cluster of those, the phrase that Rosa and I use in our unfinished joint paper is grain-sensitive materialism, which is supposed to not be gesturing too much towards functionalism or too much towards type identity theories. It's the idea that there are mental properties that are probably very multiply realizable, intentional properties of various kinds. And then there's the sort of the ones closer to felt experience, which might be much more demanding with respect to the physical details. So it needn't be the same story for all of the different mental properties that we're interested in. In response to Anil's question, I mean, it does seem an obvious question for me to have thought about, but I haven't thought about it in quite those terms before. Right. I mean, my first instinct is to think that once you're talking about extremely fine-grained goings-on, what's done that is extremely fine-grained physically, a level that's very demanding on the hardware, then the choice that he offered might be a false dichotomy. That's my sort of instinct, but I'm not sure if that's right. I'm not sure if I should really be taking sides. I think I've just got to think about that one. I take the point.
That's great. And yeah, we will, for the record, make these questions available to you after the talk, Peter, so that you can have time to read through them and process them a little bit more. Though this is not necessarily to say that people should expect replies from Peter after the talk. Okay, let's go to a couple of quick questions from Jonathan Simon, one of which invites you to elaborate a little bit more on the point you were making about sentience and moral status at the very end of your talk. So Jonathan writes, question 1 is about gradualism. If gradualism means there are creatures such that there is no fact of the matter about whether they are sentient or not, does that mean that there is no fact of the matter about whether they have moral status or not, according to sentientism? Or do they have 50% moral status? What else would we say? This could get messy. Penny for your thoughts. So I can stop there and then ask another short question that he asks.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I gave a lecture at Harvard a few months ago, and something unexpected happened that was helpful to me. When I described sentientism in that lecture, not for this reason, I used the following formulation. I said, how did I say it? All and only sentient beings are worthy of moral consideration. I used the word worthy of moral consideration. And then when we got to the gradualism problem, which is a big problem, right? Is it, one picture which the question embodied was one in which you have a yes, you have a no, and you just have a sort of amorphous gray, no fact of the matter range. Another possibility is that there's a kind of there's some structure within the no fact of the matter area. There you can be closer to the no end or closer to the yes end. And if there's structure there, then what one thing that Salim said in this discussion, he said, well, worthiness is helpful here because you can be more or less worthy. Worthiness, being worthy of moral consideration, you can just be you can it sort of lends itself to a gradient treatment in a way that some other formulations of sentientism don't. I thought, oh, that is very helpful. I mean, it doesn't solve the problem. And I think that the shape of a solution eventually is more likely to be a picture in which it's not that we hang on to our existing term, conscious or sentient, and just give it this difficult structure where there's a scale or there's a space and there's a gray area and so on. Rather, as we learn more, we'll replace that term with a finer grained, as yet unknown vocabulary. We'll have different categorizations, different ways of setting things up. The gray area cases will have a positive description. They won't just be gray area cases. They'll be real cases of something which we haven't yet got a good language for. And one possibility on the moral side might be that some of the sort of presently hidden structure in the indefinite cases might be such that different kinds of moral consideration attaches to those particular strands, which are now currently just in a sort of big mess of a sort of, not quite a yes for sentience, not quite a no for sentience gray area. Do you see what I mean? That there might be a finer grained story on the philosophy of mind front that lends itself to a finer grained attachment of ethical consideration.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Sentientists are already developing a vocabulary for other reasons why you might want these kinds of gradations, right? So one possibility is that some beings might have higher welfare capacities, might be able to experience more intense or prolonged forms of happiness or suffering. Another reason might be that some beings might be more likely to be sentient at all, given the evidence available to us. And people are exploring the possibility that we should give more moral weight, so more weight in our deliberations to beings who are more likely to be sentient or who are likely to be sentient more in the sense of experiencing more happiness or suffering, or both, right? And you might think that similar sorts of adjustments or refinements to a sentientist view would extend to this idea of gradualism with respect to whether one counts as sentient at all.
I'll just note that the two gradients you mentioned are within what I call the sort of easy,
Yeah. No, this is harder for
cases.
sure.
if there's a step from no to yes, a minimal yes, and then there are questions of degree after that, then it's not a very hard thing to think about. It's like, yes, you're in you're in, and now there is a finer grained question about what kinds of consideration, what kind of concern is applicable, but you're sort of in. And with respect to the uncertainty question, it's also a sort of easy case. I take it that the harder cases are, the harder possibility is when we look at earthworms, we look at sea anemones, and we can see some of what we think is important. And this links perhaps back to Jesse's question a little bit too. We can see some of what we think is important, but we don't have, but our picture says they don't sort of clearly pass or fail the test.
Okay, great. So we have about 5 minutes left, time for maybe a couple more questions. So how about we quickly revisit your exchange with David Chalmers? There are some more comments about this, so I can read one from David, and then if time permits, there might be one more that we can discuss. So David says, Peter says, I think that for purposes of replacement arguments, it is not good enough that the simulation share cognitive capacities. It has to share specific behavior, for example, for the argument to go through. That may be true for what I call the dancing qualia argument, which turns on switching back and forth between two isomorphic processes in the brain, but I don't think it applies to the original fading qualia argument, which just turns on a gradual transition from the neural system to the silicon system. For that purpose, it's okay if specific behavior changes somewhat along the way due to approximation, as long as the general cognitive profile stays pretty similar, as I, Dave Chalmers, have argued that it will. there will still be the same trilemma between conscious experience fading, gradually disappearing, or sticking around. So do you have any reactions to that reply?
I see. Yeah, I see the difference between the dancing case and the fading case. I see the relevance of that difference. In the fading case, Dave is saying the pressure comes from the fact that you've got an intact person, you start to replace their parts, they start to behave differently, they start to do everything differently. The insides are different to some extent. The behavior is different. They might look a little robotic, for example. The pressure is supposed to come from the fact that despite those differences, it's a problem to say that as those differences accumulate, experiential differences accumulate too, and experiential differences can include fading. And that's what I think. I don't. The pressure from the argument, as I understood it, came from the fact that so much is unchanged. Why should experience be changing? And when I press on functional properties and insist that a lot is changing, it's not the same system. It's different stuff going on inside, different behaviors. And as you add more artificial parts, the differences get more and more and more. Now I'm being told that as those changes occur, it's problematic to also say experience is transformed and perhaps disappears slowly. I don't see why that's difficult at all. I think that's quite a natural way to respond to it.
Okay, great. Thank you. I will take a moment to ask one question that I have, and then again, we do have other questions too, and we will send those to you so you can take a look at them if it might be helpful for your work. So a question that I have is, when it comes to questions about moral status, when it comes to questions about whether to include a being in the moral circle, as I was noting before, these are obviously very difficult issues, and I think this kind of argument might make me more or less confident that a particular theory of consciousness is true, and so particular beings are conscious. But I think that it would be difficult to achieve anything close to certainty about whether this is the correct theory of consciousness and whether particular beings are conscious. And so for me, the relevant question is, does a particular being have a reasonable chance of being conscious, as far as I can tell, given the information available to me? And with that in mind, I would just be curious to hear you tell us what your own credence is that your story about what is required for consciousness is correct, and that this is in fact the bar for whether a being counts as sentient. Like are you close to certain subjectively, or would you say this view is more likely than not to be correct, or how do you think about that?
I don't think I can give a straightforward answer to that, because I think that there's different bits of the view, and each of the different bits I have different levels of confidence in. I further think that our language is going to get transformed. I don't think that we have a sort of straightforward grasp on the explanandum such that we can just sort of bring a theory onto it and solve the problem. I think everything's going to be transformed. Having said that, thinking about the work on the experience relevant role of large-scale dynamic properties of nervous systems in animals like flies and so on, I find myself thinking that we've probably greatly underestimated the number of invertebrates that experience their lives. And I was on the side of thinking of insects as very questionable when I wrote the book Other Minds. I now don't think that. And it now looks kind of weird that I thought that. So I find myself quite a bit, above 0.5 with respect to some claim about the greatly expanded breadth of the range of invertebrate animals that have felt experience. But I say that thinking that our category of felt experience is probably going to be transformed in sort of half a dozen ways in the next decade or so, and that I think, making very definite bets that this explains that at this point is a little bit overambitious, or at least I think it's overambitious. So a lot of confidence that nervous systems are special, and that multiple realizability, substrate neutrality arguments got us heading down the wrong road for some decades. A lot of confidence in that. A lot of confidence, or a fair bit of confidence, that some of the important properties of nervous systems are all over the animal kingdom. And there's different degrees of complexity. You've got very neurally simple animals that have some of what's important. And then you've got animals like flies that are surprisingly, flies have active sleep. They respond to anesthesia like we do. They have attention. Insects are surprising in a way that's just, I think, empirically, very striking, and there's something bigger going on there than we had thought. Is that a helpful response? I realize it's evasive on some points.
Yeah, no, it is helpful. I think it makes a lot of sense that you would have different levels of confidence in different parts of the view, and that you would want to acknowledge that a lot is going to change around us as we better understand these issues, and we might not be thinking with these frameworks anymore, and then to somehow reconcile your confidence in particular aspects of your view with the reality that we have often confidently been wrong about these issues in the past, right? And starting from those points, then try to arrive at some kind of subjective level of confidence about particular types of silicon-based systems being conscious and morally significant. I think that is the right starting point. And obviously it's a much longer conversation to figure out where to go from there.
On this, just in closing, I would love it if there was adventurous work on the hardware side, artificial systems, hybrid systems. I think organoids attached to artificial parts and brainoids and things. I didn't talk about them, but they're very interesting. But they're a sort of obviously interesting thing. Just totally different hardwares, artificial systems that have different hardwares that might be more brain-like with respect to the things that I was making a case for. I hope people are out there thinking about that kind of thing somewhere.
Great. Well, thank you for that. Researchers, please take note that might be an interesting area for research. And okay, we are a little bit over time now, and I want to be respectful of everybody's time, so we can bring this event to a close. But let me say, first of all, thank you to Peter for taking the time to join us and give this talk. We really appreciate it. It was a fantastic talk, fantastic discussion. Thank you to everybody for attending. We had more than 160 people streaming. Many more people are going to be interested after the talk. We obviously had a fantastic discussion, lots of great questions and comments. And so thank you so much to everyone for taking time out of your day to be a part of this session. I just, again, want to also thank the Center for Bioethics at NYU and the Center for Mind, Brain, and Consciousness at NYU for co-sponsoring the event and supporting it in general, and in some cases for attending and asking questions. Thank you so much to that. And finally, thank you to the weather in Australia for holding up and allowing us to have this session and not have any major gaps. And we will send those questions to you so you can take a look at them. Everybody, your questions will be seen, even if not responded to. Have a great day, everybody, and thanks again.
Thanks, Jeff. Thank you.